Just got some feedback there. Someone's got their couple of microphones on in the same room.
Yeah, I muted them.
Okay, great. Welcome everyone. This is the AMPC webinar on the results for the 2024 Environmental Performance Review. And joining us today is the project provider, Dr. Brad Ridout from CSIRO, and the AMPC team, Lauren Smith, Caitlin Morrix Fredericks, and myself, Matt Deegan. Before we commence, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country and their unique connections to land, sea and nature. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people attending the webinar today. So just a bit about the webinar before I hand over to Brad. Our project provider and presenter, obviously Dr. Brad Ridout, is a research scientist with expertise in life cycle sustainability assessment in the agriculture and food sectors. The AMPC EPR for Environmental Performance Review began in 1998, and it's helping processes to build trust within their communities and with their customers through transparency concerning their environmental performance as a sector. The 2024 EPR contains de-identified aggregated data collected through surveys, which in 2024 represented 67% of total sector throughput. So this informs the value chain stakeholders and sustainability frameworks, such as the beef sustainability framework and the sheep sustainability framework, of the sector's progress on environmental performance. So Brad will present on the Australian red meat processing environmental performance for 2024 and include some sectoral updates on environmental KPIs, and he'll also discuss some insights and potential actions for sectoral improvement. There'll be time for Q&A at the end of Brad's presentation. If you have any questions that you'd like to enter as we go, you can use the Q&A function as the chat function is off. So hand over to you. Thanks, Brad.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Let me first start by sharing my screen. How's that? Is that visible to everyone? All good? Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Matt. And good afternoon, everyone. It's a great privilege to be with you. I think it's afternoon everywhere, even over in WA. But let me begin by saying a big thank you, because the survey could not have been conducted without the support of all the different processors who contributed their data. I know it's not an easy process. We try and make the survey as simple as possible, but it does cover a lot of different dimensions, and it does take a bit of work to submit it. And so a big thank you to everyone, and also for your support in answering my follow-up questions. I know for some of you, I was emailing and phoning back and forth a few times there over December and even January, and you're very patient and helpful. And of course, the quality of the environmental performance review depends on the quality of the data that you submit to me. And so, you know, the whole process is not possible without you. And it is an important project because you are a very important industry. I think the AMPC says there's something like 140,000 people employed in your industry. So it is very important, although it's an industry that's not without its opponents. And so this survey, I believe, plays a critical role in showing that for a very long time now. Matt talked about the survey beginning in 1998. You've got a long record of showing concern about your environmental impacts, an awareness about your environmental impacts, willingness to be transparent about those impacts, and also, as this survey has demonstrated over time, continual improvement. Survey after survey, and indeed this survey has shown some really impressive results. Not in every dimension, but in many dimensions, the results are really something to be celebrating, I think. So this year we had a record level of participation, and that's a wonderful thing because it shows that more people value the survey, more people are collecting the data and using the data in their own organisations, because if you're not collecting the data, it's very difficult to share it with me. So it's showing that more of you are measuring and monitoring these different environmental attributes. And this year we had 43 sites participating, which, as you can see, is a massive growth since I go back to 10 sites in 2005. I'm not sure how many sites there were in 1998. That's a bit before my involvement in it. But 43 sites is quite impressive. And those sites were very diverse. Some sites processing something around 5,000 tonnes hot standard carcass weight, other sites up around 140,000 tonnes hot standard carcass weight. So real diverse set of sites that have been participating, covering some sites that process only beef, cattle, other sites just processing small animals, and of course others that are processing a range of large and small animals. And the sites came from all over Australia. I think New South Wales was 9, Queensland 9, South Australia 3, Tasmania 3, Victoria 11, and WA 8. 30 of the sites had rendering facilities as part of their operation. 13 sites did not. So all we can say from this is that it's a high level of participation and a diverse range cross-section of the industry. And as Matt mentioned the figure of 67. I thought it was 68. At least my numbers work it out at 68% of industry production being covered. I guess it depends on what your estimates are for the whole sector. I took mine from the ABS Livestock Products Australia, and what you can see there is that we've got just over 68% of beef cattle, just over 68% of mutton and lamb, and overall just over 68, obviously, for total processing, which in any industry survey, to capture 68% of production is quite extraordinary, I think. It's well above 50%, and I don't think there'd be too many industry surveys that would be as comprehensive as this. And that shows that the results are robust, they're representative, but we also have to be mindful that there wasn't 43 sites last time, and the number of sites is increasing. So it's capturing new participants all the time. Mostly when people start to join the survey, they continue on with the survey year by year. I think the biggest barrier to participation is for sites actually having the data. If they've got the data, they generally are able to participate quite easily in the survey. But there's new participants joining all the time. And so although we do compare the figures from one survey to another, just something to have in the back of the mind is that sites are joining who may be newer on their sustainability journey. They may be just been working at it for fewer years, and therefore their results may not be as good as the others, but we don't make any attempt to reconcile that. We just take it as a sample of the industry as best as we can. Another thing to be mindful of in interpreting the data is that production levels were 30% higher than they were in 2022, which is when the industry was society was coming out of COVID. There were constraints on the supply of animals in workforce and exports and all these other issues that emerged during COVID. So the environmental performance review indicators, many of them took a backward step in the 2022 survey, which we attribute to the fact that the industry was working at below capacity, substantially below capacity in some respects. So we were expecting that the 2024 results would be significantly better than they were in 2022, but they can be compared also to 2020 when the industry was working, this was before the impacts of COVID, and the industry was more or less operating at full steam. But even then, you can see that the production levels compared to 2020 were slightly higher for beef, but quite a bit higher for mutton and lamb. And that meant that the industry has grown overall since that time. So when comparing any indicator results to 2022, do be mindful that that was an abnormal survey year, you might say, and results relative to 2020 may be worthwhile considering. Okay, scope of operations. One new dimension to the survey this year is we tried to get, for the first time, an understanding of the scope of operations, because we realise that meat processing operations, it's not just about making carcasses. You're involved in many cases, very complex processes with a lot of value-added processing and other products and operations occurring on the site. And so most of those additional operations and value-adding processes are associated with energy and resource use as well. So as well as comparing how the environmental indicators vary from survey to survey, we need to be mindful that the industry scope of operations is in a constant flux and evolution as well. So for the first time, we've tried to get a snapshot of what we have. So in 2024, we had 82% of sites were, 14% were processing carcass parts only, or carcass parts, 82% primal cuts, and 4% retail ready cuts. Equal proportion was leaving the site chilled as frozen. 100% of sites were doing something with skins or hides. 81% of sites were involved in some form of blood processing, 95% of sites involved in some form of offal production, 70% of sites were undertaking rendering operations, which, as you know, is very energy intensive step in the process. And then 77% of sites were involved in some kind of other product. And we also asked the question whether there were new or increased productions, and many sites indicated that retail ready cuts, a greater proportion of their production was leaving frozen. 8 sites were further engaged in hide or skin processing. And as you can see, the list there, involvement in all sorts of things, from producing products such as intestines, medical products, laboratory products, and other specialty blood products. In some cases, they were not wanting to say exactly what those products were because there was some sort of commercial niche involved. So heading into the environmental indicator results, the first environmental indicator we have is water use, which is relevant to all sites, but especially those sites that work in regions where water scarcity can become an acute problem. But as you can see, the water use per tonne hot standard carcass weight has fallen in every survey period and reached a low of 7.3 kilolitres per tonne hot standard carcass weight for the whole industry. Slightly higher use of water for beef cattle processors than sheep and lamb processors, which is the same as what was discovered back in 2022, whereas beef cattle processors were using marginally more water per tonne hot standard carcass weight processed. This year we found a small but important increase in the water demand met by recycling, now at 16%. And it may be of some interest to know that town water contributed 77% of water intake, ground or bore water 15%, and direct withdrawal from surface water around 8%. That has been more or less steady over time, largely reflecting the fact that sites don't change their source of water generally. Around 60% of sites had a water use efficiency target. I think there's been an emphasis on water use efficiency in the industry and with AMPC for a good period of time now. But what we found was that having a target or not having a target, there was no evidence that one group achieved greater efficiency than another. It's just that some businesses like to set targets, find it helpful to set targets, but it doesn't mean that if you haven't set a target, you can't achieve good water use efficiency results. Water submetering, 60% of sites. Again, many sites are increasing their use of water submetering to understand the water flows within the site, but there was no evidence that that led to greater water use efficiency. What we found, though, was that smaller sites were more variable in water use intensity. Some small sites achieved very low water use efficiency, and some smaller sites had among the highest level of water use per tonne hot standard carcass weight. So I guess that that could be a message for AMPC that there's more variability amongst smaller sites, and some of those sites may need, there may be opportunities to assist them. Wastewater, it takes a little bit of work to understand what's going on with wastewater. We have 4 indicators for untreated wastewater: phosphorus, nitrogen, biological oxygen demand, BOD, and fats, oil and grease. As you can see, for phosphorus, nitrogen and BOD, the numbers sort of bobble around. They haven't changed so much over time. They haven't increased, but they haven't come down greatly in many cases. But you've got to take into account that that is in the context of using less wastewater to begin with. So we could say that there is a lesser load because it's the same concentration over a smaller wastewater volume. But what is clearly coming down is the fats, oil and grease. Since 2015, where it was nearly 1,800, now down to 959, which is almost a halving. And I suspect that's because of the problems that can arise with fats, oil and grease in the covered anaerobic lagoons. And with increasing covering of lagoons and capturing of the methane, in some cases use of the methane inside the plant, there's been a greater emphasis on reducing fats, oil and grease in the wastewater stream. The overall level of wastewater production, as I mentioned, is down because water intake is down. Wastewater volumes average about 90% of water intake because there's some water obviously gets evaporated in the site one way or another. And as I mentioned before, there's increasing levels of biogas capture. Now 11 of the 43 sites, so almost a quarter, or more than a quarter actually, which makes sense in the reason why there's a focus on reducing fats, oil and grease. Discharge is mainly to irrigation and 50%, 41% to sewer. Only 9% of wastewater discharge was directly to aquatic systems. And what's important there at the lower part of the table, because this is a direct impact on the environment, this is a direct discharge of nutrients into the freshwater environment, you can see that the concentrations have been going down steadily since 2015. Now only 13 milligrams per litre for phosphorus and 23 milligrams per litre for nitrogen. In the case where water discharge is to irrigation or to sewer, there's of course, these are not directly to the environment. If they're going to the municipal wastewater treatment facility, then there may be advantages for the business in reducing the nutrient loads in terms of the license with the municipal wastewater treatment, but there's an additional level of treatment before there's a discharge to the environment. So that's why we distinguish between untreated wastewater versus wastewater that's being discharged to the environment. Energy use. Very substantial reductions in energy use, now 2,897 megajoules per tonne hot standard carcass weight, and I guess that reflects a major focus on energy use efficiency across the industry. And I can only assume that's because energy is an important cost of production, and with the increasing costs of energy, it's become a focal point within the industry and important for many businesses to achieve energy use efficiency, and it's made investment in energy use efficiency much more viable. Sheep and lamb processors were slightly more efficient with energy than beef cattle processors, which is a turnaround compared with 2022, but that may just reflect the variations in the sample from survey to survey. But what's very interesting is that natural gas is now the largest source of energy. 30% of energy was coming from natural gas, 31% of energy from electricity, and coal use shows reductions for 3 years in a row now. Back in 2020, it was nearly 20% of energy use, 14.5% in 2022, now down to 10.9%, which shows that the industry is phasing away from the direct use of coal. Biogas was 7.4% of industry energy demand, which is similar to previous years, and biogas beef cattle processing, it's 10.3% because most of the biogas production is being generated and used within beef cattle producers rather than the sheep and lamb producers. Efficiency targets, 50% of sites had these for energy use efficiency, but once again, we were not able to discern statistically any evidence that having a target led to greater energy use efficiency than not having a target. Not to say targets are a bad thing if that's the way in which the site organises itself and goes about its activities, but these efficiencies can be achieved without targets. Greenhouse gas emissions. Similar impressive reductions. From back in 2010, 554 kilograms CO2 equivalent per tonne hot standard carcass weight, now down to 330. And in line with the energy use efficiency, the sheep and lamb processors were slightly more efficient than the beef cattle producers in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, what's driving these improvements in emissions? A number of things making their contribution. Firstly, the energy use intensity was down 15.7%, which was talked about on the previous slide, but also the emissions intensity of electricity. And remembering electricity was 31% of total energy demand, but the greenhouse gas emissions intensity of electricity nationally has decreased by 9.8%, or for the sample of these sites, it decreased by 9.8%. It's not decreased by exactly the same proportions in every state. Emissions intensity of other energy use was also down 5.1%. And that, for example, is explained by the shift away from coal towards natural gas. Emissions intensity of wastewater treatment was down 30%. For example, contributing to that is the increased utilisation of covered anaerobic lagoons. 36% of sites had emissions reduction targets, but there was no evidence of lower emissions intensity for sites that had a target. And the pie chart shows you there that 52% of greenhouse gas emissions were from electricity, 30% were from Scope 1 emissions. These are direct emissions coming from the site due to other forms of energy, 17% from wastewater treatment, and a tiny amount coming from refrigerants and that sort of thing. Waste to landfill. This is where we obtained some surprising results because whereas all the results up until now have been tracking in a positive direction, here the results went the other way. But so we had to dig a little deeper and ask some further questions to get an understanding of what was going on. And in part it may be because of variation in quality of the waste tracking and the waste data collection, but there were also some anomalies that I'll speak about in a moment. But as you can see there, the waste to landfill increased to 21.5 kilograms per tonne hot standard carcass weight processed, and that was mainly coming from sheep and lamb processors. And what we found to explain this increase in waste going to landfill was that there was a group of processors that had joined the survey that were reporting disposing of large quantities of organic waste to landfill because they lacked alternatives. And the sites themselves were largely well aware of the situation and were actively exploring and looking for solutions. But as you can imagine, most organic waste from the yard wastes and from paunch wastes and so forth, they go into some form of composting normally, and the non-commercial animal parts usually end up going to some sort of rendering process, either at the site or to somebody else in the neighbourhood who operates a rendering facility. But some of these sites were in a situation where they either had no composting facilities, or composting facilities were at their capacity, and so it was leaving them with only option as to landfill in the short term, or they were in rural areas where they had no rendering and were forced to landfill non-commercial animal products as well. So this was new discovery in this survey, but we think we more or less understand what is causing this higher result this time, and I guess the question is to look through what might be done to improve that in future. A few sites also reported atypical construction and demolition waste, and maybe we need to create a separate category for that in future surveys, because those wastes are not directly related to meat processing. They're more related to the development of the infrastructure, and although they are occurring on site, there's a question as to whether they should be included or not into this survey in future. I already mentioned that quality of the data is variable. I guess sites measure things in ways which make sense to them. Where there's a value in measuring things more closely, they're usually measured. But it was obvious that some sites are measuring waste in a fine degree of detail and could provide lists of finely delineated waste streams, where other sites are really only sharing information on general waste, because it would appear that the segregation of waste data is not available, probably because the opportunities for disposal of segregated wastes and recycling of those wastes is not practical in their area. Fewer sites had a waste reduction target, suggesting that it's not as important an issue as things like water use efficiency, greenhouse gas emissions and energy use. But once again, there was no evidence of lower levels of waste, and that could just be that that the statistical power of this is not very strong, given the variability between sites. And as I talked about, local waste recycling opportunities appeared to be the important factor. All sorts of different wastes were being recycled across the industry, but not all those wastes were recycled in all places, whether that's because there's an opportunity for greater recycling or whether those opportunities for recycling just don't exist in all places. That's, I guess, a question mark. Then we looked at local amenity, odour complaints and noise complaints. And this is very site specific because some sites are located in areas where they've got a lot of sensitive neighbours. They're on the outskirts of town where there's residential encroachment, or they're in built up areas, or other sites are in more open areas where there's some distance between themselves and anyone who might be objecting to odour or noise. But mostly odour complaints came from residential neighbours, more than 90% of them. Rendering and animal manure were the most common source of complaints. Occasionally, the source of the complaints were undefined. A complaint was made, but there was no ability to determine what was the cause. And in another case, or a few other cases, I forget exactly which, but there were the complaint was made to the meat processing business when it was found to actually emanate from another business in the area. As I mentioned, it's a site-specific issue related to who your neighbours are and how close they are. Around 60% of sites recorded no odour complaints. Either they didn't have sensitive neighbours, or the site was very well managed in terms of controlling any odours. And the point that it was notable that a single incident can lead to multiple complaints, where it can take a few days or weeks to rectify the issue. It can quickly exponentially increase the number of complaints. In terms of noise complaints, they're quite rare, less than one per site per year. All noise complaints came from residential neighbours. Most sites obtained no noise complaints, and their most common source of complaints was trucks. So sustainability framework metrics, as Matt mentioned, this report, in addition to its value for the use by the industry and its members, feeds into the Australian beef and Australian sheep sustainability framework. And this is where you can see the results for 2024 compared to 2022. For sheep sustainability framework, they have 3 indicators: water intake, which has shown an improvement; greenhouse gas emissions, which shows another very impressive improvement, but the solid waste went backward for the reasons that we've already discussed. For beef sustainability framework, they have 4 indicators: greenhouse gas emissions, massive decrease compared to 2022, bearing in mind that 2022 was an unusual year. Energy demand is much the same, met by biogas. Water intake showing a decline, and solid waste to landfill also showing a healthy decline for the beef producers. So some general observations. Once again, the survey is not possible to conduct without everyone's participation and willingness to get involved. And so that is acknowledged, and thanks to all for your contributions in terms of answering questions and submitting data. There was improvement in many key indicators, most key indicators, and sifting through the text responses that were given, it appears that there was a combination of capital works led to the improvements, but also it was noted by some sites that it was not necessarily that they'd invested in a major new water treatment plant or a big solar panel investment with batteries or anything like that. It was just a case of taking small wins. It could be through awareness programs so that all the staff recognise the importance of using water efficiently, or sometimes it was to do with new monitoring and control systems. Sometimes it was due to practical process changes that led to efficiencies, all part of improving business operations, I guess. So overall, the industry is doing it at different levels. and I've said many times that all the sites have something in common and they're all processing red meat, but each site has its own particular opportunities and challenges. And no two sites are identical in that respect. Some sites made note of assistance from AMPC and also other government programs that they were involved with and benefiting from. There was still a very large variation between sites, so that might suggest that there is scope for these improvements and gains that we've talked about today, for them to continue and for further gains to be made. Target setting was common, but not essential, as was mentioned. What seemed important is that while sustainability can be viewed through the lens of corporate social responsibility, doing the right thing, meeting stakeholder and expectations, the leading driver really seemed to be about the business imperative for resource use efficiency. And that's what seemed to be coming through in the comments and the data that, as far as I was observing it. Size is no barrier to environmental performance, but as was mentioned earlier, smaller sites can be more variable, and maybe smaller sites have some challenges in achieving environmental objectives that larger sites and sites that are part of a corporate structure that they have different challenges perhaps that could be looked into. And as I just mentioned, each site has its own unique characteristics and opportunities that have to really be understood and actioned at the local level. So that's the end of the formal presentation. I've miraculously reached exactly 40 minutes, which was the direction from Matt. So there's plenty of time to answer questions if you have any, and I'm happy to share whatever information I can.
Thanks, Brad. Good presentation. We're just looking at the Q&A. There's no questions. There was a comment from Jacob around the difference between performance of those facilities with and without targets. That doesn't seem to be significant, which is interesting to note, that one. I have feel free, anyone, to pop in some questions now. I've got a question for you, Brad. I hadn't noticed before, and it was around emissions intensity of the electricity being consumed by members, and it was down 10% in emissions intensity from
9.8 something, I think it was.
Yeah,
10%.
roughly 10. Yeah, from 22 to 24. Is that decarbonisation in the grid, or because maybe there's some solar in that as well on site, but is most of that in the grid?
Yes, that is exclusively assessed on the purchased electricity, and it reflects. I mean, probably only when you see it like that you realise the rate and pace of the adoption of renewable energy generation sources in the wider electricity industry. Now, it's not the same in every state, and some states have much lower emissions intensity for their electricity than others. It could reflect also some minor shifts. I'm not sure if we had more sites from Tassie this time. I mean, the more sites you have from Tassie, the lower the emissions intensity of electricity is going to become. I'm not sure if that was a factor, but it just reflects the fact that the emissions intensity of the electricity in the grid has stepped down substantially.
Maybe there was an extra one or two from Tassie, but you wouldn't have thought, as one or two plants representing 68% of total throughput, that would have a significant impact in the order of 10% emissions reduction in grid electricity.
No, I think it's largely reflecting the progress that has been made in reducing the emissions from the electricity network.
Yeah. So my second question from that is then we have an electrification task as part of our decarbonisation strategy for the sector, and decarbonisation relates to a successful task because it's taking advantage of decarbonisation in the grid already. So have you got any comments for that? Are we doing the right thing with electrification, and how long do you reckon before grid electricity, for example, will be less emissions intensive than gas?
That's a big question and difficult one for me to answer on the fly. I have no idea, to be honest with you. I don't really know, and I wouldn't like to try and
fair enough.
forecast.
Fair enough. We've got more work to do on that one, I think, is what we're agreeing on around taking advantage of decarbonisation in the electricity grid, because the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Emissions and Water is making projections of 80% renewable electricity in the grid by 2030, which is really significant. And from the evidence you've provided today, Brad, the 10% already reduction between 2022 and 2024 is most of that's already in the grid. So we're seeing it happen. So this decarbonisation of the grid is not a fairy tale. It seems like it's taking hold.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, that 10% that we've seen in the data is real electricity that has been generated and used by the industry. That's already banked in. Now, I'm not an energy network specialist, but I can only imagine that the further you go down that pathway, the more difficult it becomes. It's like anything in life. But that's the government's policy. So So that's what it is.
Yeah, very good. Have we got any other questions there, Loz? None others came in. If anyone would like to ask a question, feel free, put your hand up, take yourself off mute if you can, ask a question. We've still got 10 or 15 minutes left.
There's heaps in the Q&A, Matt.
There's a few questions in the Q&A, Deeks.
Oh, do you want to read them out, Loz?
Yep. So thanks, Hamish. Question: did the data capture how much increase in on-site generation from renewable sources in the past 2 years or more? For example, solar, PV, biogas, biomass.
Yes, I'm just quickly flicking through the report. There's table 9 in the report, which I assume can be easily and freely accessible by everyone. Wind and solar in 2022 was 0.1% of energy demand was through wind and solar, which was all solar. I don't believe anyone was actually using a windmill. That increased to 0.3 of total energy demand. So it's actually increasing, but it's still very small. But I also noted that several sites talked about large-scale PV installations which were either new or coming online or in planning, or they talked about them as new initiatives. So maybe we're going to see in 2026 that percent step up quite a bit again. I can only expect that given the number of sites that talked about it. And in terms of biogas from wastewater treatment, it still stays around 7 to 8%. It hasn't really changed greatly, but once again, some sites had installed covered anaerobic lagoons. One or two sites talked about new initiative, or a few sites talked about initiatives to actually utilise the methane generated within the plant. And as that becomes increasingly common, the renewables generated on site by biomethane produced from wastewater treatment, that is likely to increase.
All right,
So
I'll go to the next one there. Thanks, Brad. Greg asked about benchmarking. You'll get your results on that, Greg. It's a different project run by ERM Energetics, so that will be coming out under a different project. Next question there from Taz. The sites with rendering plants would have had much higher megajoules per tonne of hot standard carcass weight. Ours was at about 5,300, and we render third-party material. Yes. Is there stratification reports on this?
Yes,
again,
we factor that in because we use, like, say, for example, with water use, we want to have a figure for beef and a figure for sheep and lambs and goats. And so it would be easy if sites only process beef or only process small animals, but there's quite a few sites that process both. So we use a linear regression model to solve for the water use for beef and lamb separately. And so we do the same thing with energy use in terms of with rendering as an additional factor. So we take into account not only the amount that is processed in terms of hot standard carcass weight, but also the amount of rendering. And so that takes into account sites that don't do rendering. It takes into account sites that render some of their material, not all, sites that render all their material, and sites that render all their material, and some for other sites as well. So that's where those factors are all taken into account. Otherwise, nothing would be relevantly comparable.
Thanks, Brad. Is there some more there, Loz?
Yeah, Pat had a question about the increase with in waste from sheep processing potentially being sheepskins, because obviously we've seen a bit of a crash in the sheepskin market and there's not a lot of value. Did you want to comment on that, Brad?
I just forget exactly, but some sites had no access to rendering. And so all the non-commercial parts of the animal were being sent to landfill, and that would include any non-commercial skins as well.
And that there's some future work in the pipeline around non-commercial value hides and skins, and the project is around pre-treatment of hides and skins to get them in a state where they can be broken down into smaller pieces suitable for rendering. They're very tough, as you'd appreciate, and we don't have a really good solution for that right now, but that's a future piece of work as well to get them back into rendering. So can you see any others there, Roz? Okay.
No, that's it there for me. Someone did raise their hand but lowered it, so I presume their question was answered.
Maybe that was Will Green. Will? Are you with us? Do you want to take yourself off mute?
Yeah, I accidentally raised my hand there, but I guess I do have a comment or question. Yeah, it just seems a real shame that organic materials going to landfill when, you know, every government seems to be claiming that they want to encourage a circular economy. I just wonder if anyone's going to comment on how we can improve that situation. Yeah, like I know near where I'm situated, you know, the composting industry has grown with the circular economy, but now they're under a lot of scrutiny from odor complaints and that sort of thing. So, you know, they're in a situation where they've got to do massive investments or shift their location or whatever.
You want to answer that, Brad, or?
Oh, well, I think you put your nail on an opportunity or a challenge, let's say. I mean, each business has got its own issues with this regard, those that are disposing of organic waste to landfill. It's not that they set out with that intent or they're against the circular economy. I mean, if they had an opportunity, but it's got to make sense to the business as well. So I think that it's something to go into the pot of ideas that AMPC deal with to see whether they can work towards some solutions where there aren't solutions today to make it viable for businesses in that situation to have viable alternative pathways for this organic waste.
Yeah, so it was a good question, Will, and relates to some future work as well around bioenergy in particular. So, you know, bioenergy is taking a bigger share of the thermal energy needs of processes, but we do have work around improving the productivity of biogas production, and some of those organic solids need to be pre-treated in different ways to enhance that the productivity of that anaerobic co-digestion, digestion, whatever the case is. So that there's some work around that. It takes time to prove methods and then have them implemented. But good question, and there is some work on that as well going forwards. I just saw one from Carl. Carl said, significant improvement in energy productivity. Do we know the impact of increased production versus implemented initiatives? Brad?
No, we don't have the capacity to tease that out. Yes, I don't have an answer, and it may well differ from different sites. You might reach a certain level of production which is most efficient, and only you would know that for your particular site. But no, it's a great question, but I can't shed any further light on that.
We probably could say, tell me if I'm out of order here, but the bioenergy part of what's happening in renewables is continuing to improve, although it's steady. We're seeing case studies. I mean, JBS has done some recent work at 2 plants around increasing bioenergy. The bioenergy numbers are now, that's biogas and biomass, is 14% of total energy, and which is higher than coal. So that could be an indication of implementation. You know, it takes time for these things to be implemented, doesn't it? But we can see progress that way, physical progress. Is there any others there, Loz? Any other questions?
No, not that I could see. Taz, or everyone on the call, a copy of the recording and the webinar slides will be distributed around post-webinar.
Very good. We've only got 4 minutes left, so if there's no further questions, we'd like to thank Brad very much for his presentation today. obviously these things, these presentations and this reporting process is around acknowledging improvement, but also things that need to be improved. That's a great benefit of the work that Brad's done here, is to point out those things that need improvement that we are now looking at addressing going forwards. And the other thing is having that transparency for the value chain stakeholders. There's many of them. So thanks very much, Brad, for your presentation. Thanks everyone for attending, and we'll send a copy of this video to people that need it, if there's anyone that needs it. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Matt, Lauren.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.